you guys, thank you so much for coming.
This is Jenna.
I'm Jenna. This is Dave.
And I'm Dave.
And yeah, like we said, we're from Airbnb. We've been there for about 5+ years. I thought we'd start by just telling you a little bit about ourselves and where we came from and what we're doing now. I hailed from a 8-year career in book publishing. I had 0 experience in tech. I had 0 experience in startup. And I landed at Airbnb when they were 150 people and about to scale like crazy. So that's where I landed. And since then, I now lead the ground control team, which is our team that's focused on, like I said, designing and growing and nurturing our values-driven culture. We are all over the globe in all of our offices, and we're about 40 people. So we use the mechanisms of experiential and communications to do that. So that's me.
I'm Dave. I'm a millennial. I had to say that out loud
Hi,
in the
Dave.
space yesterday. Jenna hired me to do anything. I picked up a lot of dog shit in my first year. As we do, I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time. I got there and I noticed that people are really passionate but had no idea what was going on, so we built the internal communications function. And we recognized that there was a distinct need to sort of nourish the values of the organization and not do it in sort of a BS kind of way. And so I've been able to focus the last year or so on that. I also want to give some love to Jenna, who's my supervisor, if we're going to use the antiquated terms, but has helped sort of me go from a recovering finance person to a nomad to a pooper scooper to now responsible for making sure our organization practices our values every day. So thank you.
And then we won't do this the whole time, but when Dave first arrived after about a month, I remember saying to my mom, "Meet Dave, he's the angel sent from heaven." So it's been a very nice partnership since the beginning. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on a couple of things from yesterday. Tara was talking about, and I'm going to be a millennial and use my phone for notes. Isn't that amazing?
And she's barely a millennial.
Yeah. No, I was told I am one, so I'm going to just roll with it. That's fine. The tensions that occur when you do have the pressure to build really fast and use all the money, and then you end up with a big team of disengaged people, that's basically what this whole conversation is about, how to kind of just deal with that tension. It's real, but if you have the strength behind it, you can really avoid getting there. A lot of people also talked about purpose and wanting purpose in your jobs. That was also tagged to millennials, but I think that we could probably agree that everyone wants purpose in their job. But we also acknowledge that purpose and values are often kind of conflated. So great, everybody has purpose and we have the same purpose and we want to get to the same place, and that's awesome. But your values are how you do it and how you work together. So really making sure that those are aligned are critical, and using those values, like I said, as a means to getting to a really wonderful culture.
Cool. So as Jenna said, we called this session Forget Culture Fit for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's really catchy. Number two is we just want to go beyond culture fit. I think it's not wrong to have people who fit your culture, but for what criteria and why do they fit your culture is really important. About a year ago, we embarked on a journey to sort of discover if our values were the right ones, and if they were, how were we defining them? And we read a bunch of bad business books. This is not a bad business book. And so the author, Pat Leoncini, goes through a couple different types of values which can help distinguish. Accidental values are traits that are evident in an organization, but have come about unintentionally and don't necessarily serve the good of the organization. Basically, why everyone's here for this conference is to fix these things. Things that you would walk in and say, these are true, but they're not good. Let's do something about them. And there's kind of a dark side of this, too, which is you can hire for these accidentally if you're not really conscious of the things that you're looking for. So he describes core values as inherent behavioral traits. They lie at the heart of an organization's identity. They don't change over time, and they must already exist. So this session is not about finding those. That is a long and rigorous process. But the idea is be true to who you are. And if you can figure out what those things, what those values really are, you can sort of liberate your employees. So if everyone has a shared sort of expectation of how they work together, the need for process and everything else kind of falls by the wayside because people can anticipate how other people act. All right, so the ice has definitely been broken in this conference. It's now pretty warm, so we thought we'd just do a quick sort of interactive thing.
Yeah, so it's important to really think about and get clear on what those values and behaviors are. So we like to do a little partner exercise, person next to you. Maybe it's somebody that you now know really well after the last 36 hours. So we want you to think about somebody on a team you've worked on, in a community you've been in your company right now, that really is really successful. And what are the values or what are the behaviors that really drive that person to be successful? So think about who they are, if you think about success, what is it, and what are the behaviors that are behind that? And then share that with your partner. And then partner, we'd like you to reflect back kind of what the themes are around the behaviors that your partner is talking about. And then we'll switch. So we'll set you a timer. So pair up.
This is fun.
Ready?
Think about the people that you love working with, like just gush about them, like exaggerate, tell lies, whatever, but like really go big and then have the other person extract what those values are.
We'll give you a minute to think on your own, and then we'll give you the timer, and then you'll have a minute to talk.
So you just did a very important exercise, which is behavior attribution. So there's lots of things that happen, and we tend to be quite reactive in the workplace, and you feel things, but you don't put words to them. And so it's very important when you're interviewing or when things are unfolding at work that you can attach meaning to the feelings that you're having. I'll kind of share a little bit about our path to building a culture of values. We've kind of learned a lot of lessons the hard way, so hopefully we can impart a little wisdom rather quickly. The founders knew it was important from the beginning to hire people with shared values, but they didn't know what those were. But they did something interesting was the idea that you should consider assessing someone's technical expertise separate from the values that they bring. So although I think early on we could have been a little more clear on what those values were and probably also the technical pieces, by sort of thinking about them as two separate things, you get a better understanding of the whole person. We then have sort of scaled these cross-functional interviews. We tend to have people who are in different teams interview, and that tends to bring a really healthy balance. And what it does for a candidate is have an opportunity to talk about their experiences and their values and decide if this is a good fit, right? Like, this is not a one-way street, it's really a two-way conversation. And I think what I wish we would have done way sooner is just be really specific. So if there's one thing that you take away from this, like take your values, which can feel kind of like taglines, and make them mean something and really, really bring objectivity to the behaviors underneath them. Another key lesson, I always do that. Do you mind if we go back one? Thank you. One more. Ta-da. Okay. So you can hire people for values, great, you'd like nail this process, but if you don't practice them and if employees don't see them practice on a daily basis, they become propaganda, and even worse, they become weapons. So we have a core value called embrace the adventure, and it has been used in the absence of the other values. So what it looks like is Jenna telling me, hey Dave, just stay all night, just embrace the adventure. And so when they become weaponized like that, employees not only view it as sort of weakness on behalf of the manager that they don't have a better reason to articulate, but it compromises the whole idea of having a shared set of values to begin with. So it has to be something sacred about them. Really be specific and focus on shared behaviors. The idea is you want to understand the overlap of your organization's values with the people who you're bringing in. It won't be 100%. That's not what you're looking for. You don't want this. Even if you value diversity, you still don't want 100% of the same values, but you want a certain few things that are shared. And make sure that you hold yourself and the leaders to the highest standard. And so if everyone's sort of looking to that, if they're the ones modeling and rewarding and punishing behavior, which happens in most organizations, everyone's watching. So I was struck yesterday by the idea that everything communicates, whether you say it or not. So who gets promoted and who doesn't get promoted and whose voice is important and who's not is important. Those are all sort of reflections of values in some way. And so imparting that on leaders, making sure that they're connecting those dots becomes really important.
How do you guys do that?
So it's part of it is having clear criteria in the first place, and then you can bake it into a performance management system or whatever is the right approach. But until you have common language, it's useless. And so something that we said early on, which is important to recognize, but you have to go way deeper, is like that feels like Airbnb or that doesn't feel like Airbnb. What does that mean? And so that's really where the work comes in, is defining what those things are. And until you have the language, it's very hard to have those conversations.
And I would also add that, like, just know that, some things can be working seemingly perfectly. It's going well, and at some point, something will happen, and you'll realize that you need to shift and change. And don't be afraid of doing that. If you need to add more to your system, like the things that happened in the early days can be super organic, and that's not wrong. That worked at the time. But just know that it doesn't necessarily work over time. And so be conscious and be aware and be able to evolve. And I think that's really important. And when you think about culture, this isn't about how do we keep our culture like it was when we were 10 people. It's about what really is at our core and what does it look like as it scales and how do we evolve. So I just say that because you say, how do you hold people accountable? It's really easy to do when you're 30 people, in a way. It could be. It might be hard, I guess. But as you're big, it does get really hard. So you do have to put in more systems and guidelines and really align on those things. So just don't be afraid to shift and change as you continue to grow.
To that point, are there values that you've let go of as you've gotten
Yes.
and what are they and why?
Yeah, the question was, have we let go of values? As we did this clarification exercise, we got rid of 2 of what were 6. And what we found is we did a sort of elaborate research project, and we found that they weren't truly shared by our employees. So we said that they were important because they are core values, but they're not things that people actually self-identify with or use on a daily basis. And so what happened was we tend to call those as aspirational values. They can be really helpful. One of ours was simplify, which some people do really well and is really important in some functions, but it does not come naturally to us. And so by calling it a core value, it sort of eroded the whole. So being really conscious about the values that you state, how real are they? Would an outsider come in and say, yeah, they do that, even if they use slightly different words?
And it's nice because the aspirational values doesn't mean they go away. They're very valuable. We still use them. We still talk about the importance of simplify, but they aren't at your core. So maybe you let them go from core, but know that they're still valuable and still usable.
We built this handy-dandy core values flywheel. Full transparency, we've basically just figured this out 2 weeks ago. So don't think that this is something we've practiced and learned a lot from. I was inspired yesterday by the sauna stuff. They seem to have so deeply integrated this. We're kind of in the process of doing it now. We talked a little bit about attracting. So being public, implicitly or explicitly, about what your organization stands for, so that people can self-identify and say, I want to work for a company that has those values. Hire them based on those values. Support them, so through onboarding or education materials, help them understand it to sort of get it. There's this ramp period where they're really confused, and the values actually become really useful tools for them to navigate how to be successful within your organization. Recognize people, this is huge. Positive behavior identification is the best way to keep the flywheel moving. So it shouldn't be these heavy annual or semi-annual performance reviews, but real time, all the time. And when you have the language, you can use the words. And the key is that the language becomes natural so that it's actually used. Accountability, so this is the big thing. Everyone in the company needs to have the same criteria by which they're held accountable for. There may be more things that certain people are held accountable, but we think of core values as the basis of things that everyone must share and must be held accountable, and then reward those people. So have a performance methodology that doesn't think about performance separate from core values. So I think this is sort of a big ha-ha for us, is it's kind of the way we think about hiring, 50% expertise and impact, and 50% sort of values and how you work together, such that the impact of the collective organization is the greatest. So today is about one small portion of the flywheel, hiring. However, if your organization is growing, this has the most opportunity for leverage. Sort of beat this point already, but I think this is the aha that our founders had early on, which if you could impart or wanted to impart on your leadership, I would highly recommend.
I would just add two things at the end, just to kind of like put a cap on that. One, I feel incredibly lucky to have founders and leaders that care about this and have from the beginning. I wouldn't have a job if that weren't the case. And I recognize that that's not the case everywhere. And so if it isn't the case from the beginning at the foundation, it is harder. Like it is just going to be harder. We have plenty of people that come and want to talk to us about like how we do this or how we do that. And I acknowledge that it is hard if you don't have leadership that really puts that first. And so just know that. And so if you can work with your leaders, if it's not natural to get there, you'll have much greater opportunity for success. And the other piece is if you are successful in hiring this team that's like completely mission driven and core values aligned and you're like super successful, it is going to make it a lot harder for leadership, because if you screw up, it's emotional. Like the team they get upset. Like they really care to the point that they are going to express that. They're going to hold you accountable in a way that like goes above and beyond a team that you hired just for skill. So just know that. I think it's something, it's like one of those great things it's like an exciting thing to be aware of, but it is emotional.
So we'll try to go deep into interviewing for shared values specifically. One note too is use vocabulary that's like resonant in your organization. So if values sound too squishy, use things like objective behaviors. Or if people want something more aspirational, you can use something more aspirational. Find a way to connect it to results. We think of values as the unique things that help you further your mission, which everyone wants to do. Okay.
So what we're going to do for the exercise is that you guys are going to end up leaving here with a couple of questions that you can take back, hopefully, and use as you start to interview candidates and you're interviewing for values and behaviors. So to start, we want to talk about defining values and behaviors and just really looking at the characteristics of strong behaviors. As we said, we want to be really specific, so these aren't mushy-gushy values that you're trying to like talk to somebody about in a conversation. So they should be critical to the success of the person or team. So we kind of did that in the icebreaker a bit. They need to be actionable, observable, and objective. So before we get started, what we want you guys to do is just write down, you're going to write down 3 behaviors, values. You think of the values and the themes and write down the 3 behaviors that you want to then build questions around. If you have them already as a company, great, pick the 3 you want to focus on. If you don't, think back to the icebreaker and use some of those and just write them down, and then we'll come back to them. And then Dave's going to take this and go through some of the characteristics of the great questions, and then we're going to...
You going to give an example?
Yeah,
sure.
We'll do that.
So a difference, so one thing that we would look for conceptually is empathy. Empathy is a very hard thing to see practiced. And so think about breaking that down into, do they listen? Do they act on, do they care for others? Do they communicate in a way that reflects how that person's thinking and feeling? Are they respectful? So these often are not lofty. They're quite kind of precise terms. Set clear expectations might be one that's really useful in an organization, and it's easy to see someone do that. Is that helpful?
The last part seems to be the hardest.
Okay, so I think of actionable plus observable equals objective. So if you can use it in a sentence, hey, Jenna, can you do this? Or think about it this way, this next time. So can you listen more openly next time, please? I can also watch her listen openly in a meeting room or with the direct report. What you want to get away from here is like sentiment-driven things. So we want to err really far away from likability, anything that doesn't feel like you can define in a word what they're doing. So it's not how people make you feel, it's what they do.
It's hard. It seems to be a hard leap for me. So the
Sure.
word that keeps coming to mind is passionate. I want passionate, self-driven people. So the observable behavior for passion could look and show up in so many different ways
Right.
for each individual. So how to make that leap?
Right. So another word, I would start with synonyms, like commitment, right? So passion is kind of relative. Commitment could be too, but like when given an opportunity to commit or not commit, do they do that or not? If you think about receiving it as an employee, if you told me to be more passionate, I would tell you I'm leaving. If you told me I need more commitment out of you, that might be something I could respond to. So kind of going deeper.
But that seems a little subjective too. I mean, it's a little.
Everything is quite subjective, and so it's just going as deep as you can. Another thing that we look for is we call it owning and learning from mistakes. And so when a mistake happens, what action do they take? Do they sweep it under the rug, or do they acknowledge it? And do they follow up and take action to learn from it and share it with others? Or again, do they just sort of sweep it under the rug? If you are like having trouble, just raise your hand and like, oh, happy to talk through this. Is there one in particular?
No, I mean, I wrote down some
Okay.
I value, but I guess I was looking for more objectivity. Not some of these words like passion and how you, let's say, describe passion or how you reflect passion. It's like maybe different between one person's trying to commitment is another thing, right? There are external reasons why maybe someone in your mind might commit less versus another person, right? So how do you define what commitment is as an entire corporation?
Right. I hear you. I think we can go quite far down.
That's why I like.
That's why it's a fun conversation.
And so, yeah, I think it's so if I'm committed, what other things do? I show up to work on time, I communicate well, like maybe there's other things beyond that. So it would be relevant to the organization that sort of, what are examples of people who seem to be committed, and what are the things that they do?
So one thing we did is, I think there's a difference between the value and the behavior. They're actually two distinct things. So if we think about a value commitment, what our behavior we have supports that is we act like owners. And so our customer base is small business. So what does it mean to then act like an owner? Commitment for us is like, okay, it's like I am now the owner of the business. So we're very clear about, so what does that mean in terms of how you do that? So I think it's to put a statement around a single owner that gives more clarity to what we mean by that.
Yeah.
More clarity in what you just said.
Yeah.
Is commitment, right?
Yeah.
Because commitment is like, I don't necessarily.
Well, it's like, so there's like, you and I have very different dimensions, like what comes to mind for commitment for me could be very different for you. So it's just like, okay, so
Right.
we've got to say, what do we mean by a single owner of passion?
And I would add to that, this is the right discussion, because the other thing is that all of these conversations are very specific to everyone's culture and company. So again, when people come and they say, oh, you know, we hear you have a great culture, tell me how to do it. It's like, well, it's going to be, we can have a conversation, but I need to understand, and you need to understand, like, who you are and what your culture is. And I will give a 2-second example of this, but when I first started, what did I learn about Zappos? Zappos is an amazing culture. They totally do. I have learned so much from that organization. And I don't know, maybe 6 months after I started, I took a field trip and I went to Vegas and I went to visit Zappos, and I walked in and I was just like blown away. They so happy, like so I could just tell this is an amazing culture. I also walked out and was like, oh, you know, that was like way too much for me. And what's happening there would not have been perfect for our culture, but it was really perfect for theirs. So just knowing that and then being able to say, here's a behavior, but here's how it shows up in my organization or my organization is really important, and that can be different, but just get specific about it. And be able to articulate when you're holding people accountable how specific you're talking about. You know, that's the thing. Like, you want to be transparent about what it is that they're being measured. You want to hold people accountable, they need to know what they're being held accountable for. And that's something in the early days that we didn't do, and I'm sure many companies don't do, because it's just like implicit. You just kind of like feel it, and it feels like Airbnb, so good job, great, let's keep going. But you've got to get really specific, and it can be different.
Commitment was a bad example. I'm sorry.
Dave,
I'm the worst.
moving on.
Okay, moving on.
We want to get you to writing questions, so I'm watching.
All right, so characteristics of great questions. So they should help elicit specific stories and examples. So oftentimes people who are successful in interviews, meaning they get a yes, is they make the interviewer feel really good. And so the key as an interviewer is to go deeper than that and figure out, well, what is a time when you actually demonstrated this behavior? Or tell me how you think about this thing, less in the abstract and more in reality. You want them to be simple. I think and directional, meaning don't try to trick people. When they hear these questions that feel like brain teasers, they're really defensive, they don't know what you want, and so they're gonna give you something that's probably not what you want. So we kind of have this methodology of give candidates the best possible chance to pass the interview. Be clear about what you're looking for, but give them all the materials up front. Don't try to trick them at all. And design for questions that have easy follow-up. So Emmy was mentioning this earlier, but why, how questions can be really useful, and ones that are time-bounded. So what we'll do real quick is go through a couple questions and just sort of popcorn out and let me know if you think these are good. What are good or maybe not so great about these questions? So these are just random ones that we wrote the other night. What's a meaningful mistake that you've made in the last year, and what did you learn from it? So what's good or not good about this question in your mind? What is meaningful, or why is meaningful good?
No, I don't think it is good. I mean,
You don't think it's good?
What's meaningful to me versus meaningful to you?
Right.
So does it mean, you mean meaningful, you're trying to get to something that I learned from it? Is it meaningful, or that's what I'm like, feels like what's the trick?
Right, so there's probably lacking simplicity or specificity, sure. What else?
So it says in the last year, so it has to be something that actually happened, so that's specific.
Right. So it's specific and it's time bound, which we find for interviewers is really helpful. It's if you ask someone a question, tell me about the one time you did this one thing the best throughout your entire life. Like your mind just goes into automatic panic about, oh shit, what is the best one? So if you time bound it, you really give people the opportunity. It may not be the best example, it just has to be a good example and a recent one that they can draw more specific memories from.
How about focusing on it, not necessarily within a time frame, but a specific example that changed the way they think? I think everyone here probably in their career developing probably has those moments where it changed the direction of where they were going.
Right.
I think isn't that a little more relevant in the sense of trying to understand how philosophically they think about the world or what they do or whatever that is?
Right. Yeah, I think the question is trying to elicit is what happened and how did they learn from that thing? So it's just a different way. You can either I sometimes ask sort of a transformative learning in your life. You don't have to time bound something, but it can be helpful if you're asking sort of a bigger question. Another example. Say the culture conference were to die today, what would its eulogy be?
Good or bad question? Let's start there. Good or bad question? Okay.
It's a horrific question.
You're catching on.
These are the types of questions that people will write articles about your company on.
If you are,
Right.
yeah, if you are, especially if you are a global team, let's just
Right.
use that as an example. What is a eulogy? Assumptions, like making assumptions of understanding of questions, really bad and can really get people stuck.
Like, are you kidding? Are you serious? Do you want humor? Do you want
Yeah.
clarity?
You have no idea what you're looking for. You just assume that, well, death is bad, so I guess I'll defend why this place is a good place. Anyways, it doesn't give you a lot of signal.
It's unconscious bias because a lot of religions and people don't even
Perfect.
Exactly,
Yeah, another
right.
another reason.
Last example. Tell me about a time you've had to break difficult news to someone. Too personal? So what if it were, tell me about a time you've had to break difficult news to somebody at work?
I think it's actually a good question.
Tell me why.
I've seen it used before, technical program managers need to break bad news to develop over time, and need to break news to clients, and it's not gonna get done. I think it's got the why, how, follow-up to it. I think it's good. I think it works.
So,
You can talk about it a little bit more if you wanted to.
right. I think what is very obvious to me and hopefully to you is there will be questions that will work really well for you, like you have a comfort level with, that may not work for someone else. So the key is about honing in on those questions that you can kind of come back to and try to be able to identify themes. I like this one because it kind of talks about approach, or opens the door for approach. And most people have had to break difficult news to someone, so the assumption of what their experience has is limited, and if they don't have a good example, then you just move on. Okay. Characteristics of great feedback. We ask great questions because we want to get good answers. What are examples of good answers? Again, we're going for facts, not feelings. This goes back to like what are specific stories, reflections that they can offer, not how they made the interviewer feel. When you err on the side of feelings, you end up with a lot more culture fit than necessarily values fit. And specific examples. So if you're in a larger organization where people are reviewing, like there might be hiring panels who are reviewing feedback, when it's like, oh, I just didn't feel like blank, or I don't know about this because it just lacks the depth. And so well, the way that we talk about this is for those people who are interviewing cross-functionally, this is your opportunity to teach everyone about the values. What did you see in this candidate that has reflections of them? So every time someone reads a feedback packet, they're learning something new about the value, so it becomes a really powerful educational tool. Okay.
So I'm just here to do logistics. That's basically the point. So we're going to do the exercise part of this. We're going to do two pieces. One, we're going to do writing questions, and then the other part, we're going to do testing the questions. And you have a question to start the questions.
Yeah, I was just, before we jump into this,
Sure.
really curious, in several conversations here today, people brought up growth mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the challenges that I'm having with this is that it's sort of a fixed mindset, meaning that people hold this certain set of values, and like they can never change them, or they can never grow to encompass the values that the company wants them to have. How are you guys thinking about that?
So we have a value that's largely about growth. We take the embrace the adventure value, and we have owning learning from mistakes, curiosity. I'm forgetting another, which is a bad sign. But so like it depends what you value. If you value growth, like if you value a growth mindset, truly, intrinsically, make sure it's part of the values, and you will find people who are that way. Does that help?
I meant more in terms of you're looking for a particular value. If you're not finding it in the answers they kind of provided, does it mean that they can never have that value? Can never grow to develop that value?
Right.
I also would just say, like, going back to my evolution comment at the beginning, things will evolve. There are always, like, things that are going to be at a core that help to drive how you behave and act and evolve. So I think that though it maybe sounds static, and yes, you don't need to check, we're not like saying make sure you check every single box and this is exactly, it's not like that. It's a strong foundation, and if you have the strong foundation, then you can evolve, and it will grow and change. And there will be things that, are, and use aspirational values, right? Like those should come and change and really be driving as well. But having that, it's like just putting solid ground on the floor so that you can stand on it and do different things on it is, I think, more what this is about, and not about making sure that every single person stays exactly the same for the entire time that they're, working together. And everyone doesn't look and feel the same or act the same either, right? There is diversity in all of that, but there's a foundational floor or thread or whatever metaphor works for you, that you can rely on and that will really help everyone just charge towards the same path. Is that helpful?
One thing I would add too is it can become a slippery slope because if you value growth and someone hasn't grown, what hypotheses are you making about why they might grow someday? And does person A, how does that vary from person to person to person? And so as much as possible, you'd want to see them having demonstrated it throughout their professional career. If the hiring team decides we want to take a risk in this way, I think that's fine. But again, if you start to make hypotheses about how someone might act in an organization, you should be really careful about how you do that.
And as interviewers, it's your responsibility to be able to really listen and really hear what this person is sharing with you. That's another thing. The answer is not, we're not looking for a specific answer. We're saying we've got values and behaviors that we're looking to hear in the stories that you're telling, but it's up to the interviewer. This is why, I mean, and all the interviewers that we have, it's a huge job to be able to have those conversations and to really pick apart what you're hearing, because you're asking questions where you're not asking for a yes or no answer, and you're not trying to trick them to make sure that they use that word and they use that word. Like, people are gonna be different in the way they articulate what you're asking them, and so you need to be able to really translate what they're saying and have it reflect on your values. So.
Aren't you putting too much pressure on their ability to communicate verbally? I mean, everyone communicates in different forms, right? Some people are better at writing, some people are better at.
Right. So, I mean, we're saying interviewing, we've experimented with written exercises, right? So for people who are more introspective, having something in advance. So I think there's lots of different ways. It's really about how do you objectively gather the signal. The interview is sort of the paradigm that most companies are living in, but I do think there's more interesting and potentially diverse ways of gathering the signal.
And do you have flexibility in your interview technique based on the type of individual that you're trying to hire?
So I'll get to this when we have there's a bias section. So we use this term we call it the yardstick, and this is why the how-why questions become really essential. So I'll use something that is not our value, but is hopefully relevant. So the idea of risk-taking. Right? You want people who are willing to take calculated risks. So the natural thing to do would be, let's interview someone and understand what risks they've taken. And you'll hear all sorts of examples, everything from, I moved here and volunteered here and did this, things that feel big. And then you may hear another example of, oh, I moved away for college. Which, exactly, you're like, oh, that's not a big deal. But then you go deeper and you're like, and they might tell a story about, oh, well, I actually was working a full-time job to support my family, and this was actually like the biggest leap I could have done. I'm the first person in my family to attend school. And then you're like, whoa, that's way better than the person whose parents funded their trip around the world. And so, so that kind of relative barometer, and that's where those follow-up questions become really important. Cool. Write some questions?
Yeah. Okay, so this is, what we're gonna do is kind of cluster in groups of, and we're gonna let you guys do this on your own. I was gonna have you move chairs, but there's not enough of you, so don't worry. Cluster in groups of 6, and then we're gonna have 6-ish. I like 6 exactly. We'll make fake people if there's not enough. And then what we're gonna have you do is write questions first. You're gonna break up, and you're gonna have 3 and 3, sit down, write your questions, and then within your group of 3, you can critique each other and give feedback on those questions. And then we'll come back together. I'll give a little sign, we'll come back together, and then we'll pair you off to actually use the questions and interview somebody not part of your question critique group.
I hope this has been useful. This is the first time we've done this, so if you have feedback for us, it's clearly a little facilitation stuff we got to work on. But
Mark the change time when you're supposed to change to the other side.
Yeah.
Halfway point, people change time.
Okay.
Anything like practical content, please come to us afterwards.
Helpful.
Anything is helpful. Quick thing on bias I just want to call out. The spirit of doing this is to reduce unconscious bias. So if you go to Wikipedia and go through their list of cognitive biases, it is like painfully long, and it can feel discouraging. So some members of our team asked one, I think, really poignant question. When you, after an interview, look at what you wrote down about your feedback, and is the reason I think this way because of evidence or something else that I'm not aware of? I find sometimes I put words in the other person's mouth accidentally, and just really being mindful about that can sort of bring a lot of those biases to bear. A couple more tips that we have. Be aware how your similarities can influence your opinions, where you grew up, what you look like, friends that you have. Same with differences. It can, this is not about how we relate. This is about who we are intrinsically. And this is a bit about my yardstick earlier, but understand what the answer means to them from their life experience. So don't judge the thing, judge the reason why this thing is meaningful to them if it were, say, risk-taking or some cause that they care about. Don't judge the cause, judge the reason for the cause. And know that people's differences will equal very different responses. So, even a white man in marketing and a white man in engineering is quite likely to approach these things very differently. And so that's where it becomes more and more important to go deep into the attributes that you're looking for, and just recognize that you shouldn't expect the same answers from different people, and know that that's okay. Quick recap, I found this conference, there's so many little nuggets. We tried to just do quick 3 nuggets for you. If possible, define those values and specifically the observable behaviors behind them. So a lot of work that goes into it. But there is infinite amounts of research that suggests it's a good thing, and so take the time to do it thoughtfully. Ask questions that elicit specific examples, and most importantly, find ways to practice these things daily so they don't become corporate bullshit, which is oftentimes there's an intention on it for a moment. They have posters and this big thing, and then they sort of live in a closet, and then once a year, you get negatively evaluated against them. So find ways to bring those things into your world through recognition, through vocabulary, through education, and different things.
Just something to share about knocking words out of people's mouths and the way that we do like panel interviews or you're one-to-one with somebody and then you come back and you're going to debrief. I've seen people come back with like just a few words on their evaluation like form, and then some people who write a ton.
Right?
And it's so much better to like be taking notes and be writing down what people are actually saying, so that when you come back to circle, you can actually have something real to be discussing rather than what you colored the memory with.
So true.
And you can, I think that sometimes it's awkward when you're going into an interview to be like writing things down, but it's not that awkward if you say to the person, I'm going to take some notes while we're talking, and just be really clear and transparent about that. It's super helpful. I would think as like a candidate, I'd really like to know that what I'm saying you are hearing and are going to share in a clear way and not, and actually,
Yes.
exactly.
I always have a block after mine. We're working on this thing right now where we have our values and our behaviors. They live on a little digital page. We're building notebooks that mimic the same thing. So you can take notes in this, in an analog way in the same way that you would in a digital way. So there's no translation that you have to do. So anything that works for you to help. We discourage taking notes on a computer unless it's over Skype or something, because we've just gotten feedback from candidates that it feels like a wall between you, and they don't know if you're on GChat or Slack or whatever else. And so like the gift of attention and presence tends to elicit better responses from folks anyways, but if for some reason that works for you, then please continue to use it.
And this is a little bit, this is maybe something that we as Airbnb, and we're a hospitality company in a lot of ways, right? So we can bring that to like, just be a host of your candidate. Like, treat them as if you would like to be treated, and that will just open up the door for the answers that they give you to be a lot more authentic and trusting, just like establish that the computer is such a symbol of the wall, but there are other things that you can do in the way you act and the way you show up that can also put up the wall, so like keep that in mind as you walk into an interview.
One thing I do is I try to prime them, so I'll tell them about myself first, and I'll kind of go to a place in an interview that you wouldn't expect. Like I'll talk about this moment where I had this aha moment where I had to work for something that fostered human connection, and they may have just gone from a coding interview. And so like by giving them the permission to go there, you're much more likely to get these richer answers. So again, don't just be there in an evaluative way, give them every opportunity to succeed. Cool. Thank you for your time.
And definitely let us know if you guys have